Welcome back to Beginning with New Testament Greek by Merkle and Plummer. Today's chapter is Chapter 7 on contract verbs. So in this chapter, we'll discuss the morphology and paradigms for contract verbs, but also the imperfect indicative of a me, the alternate direct object cases, and your vocabulary. So starting with morphology. Contract verbs are verbs whose stem ends in a short vowel, alpha, epsilon, or omicron. The contraction occurs when one of these short vowels comes in contact with a connecting vowel from the personal ending. So for the word poieo, you have a short epsilon at the end of the stem. And when it comes in contact with the ending ete, the two epsilons come together and create an epsilon iota. Long vowels such as iota and epsilon are not affected. In the poiete, you can see that there is a circumflex above the iota, and that will help you to distinguish that something has happened. There are a lot of different ways that the vowels can contract, and you'll want to begin to learn these so that you're able to recognize where they come from. In the alpha contract verbs, your alpha could be interacting with an epsilon or an eta, and then it would contract into simply an alpha. If you have some sort of iota involved in the contracting vowel, then you will see that it becomes an alpha with an iota subscript. And if it has some kind of oo, either the omicron epsilon, or the omega, it will contract and the omega will take over and it will stay as an omega instead of an alpha. For the epsilon contract verbs, you're going to have an epsilon at the end of your contract verb stem. And when an epsilon interacts with another epsilon or an epsilon iota diphthong, it will turn into an epsilon iota. With an eta, it turns into an eta. With an eta subscript, it turns into an eta subscript. With an oo or an oo, it turns into the omicron upsilon diphthong. And then omega always changes to an omega. And finally, the omicron contract verbs end in omicron. And when those come in contact with an epsilon, an omicron, or an omicron upsilon diphthong, it will remain an omicron upsilon diphthong. Then you have the iota subscript or iota governed letters, and those will turn into an oi, so the omicron iota. And then the omicron added with an eta or an omega will turn into an omega. And I know this sounds like a lot, but there are a lot of great easier helps, and most of the time you're going to be not creating these, but you are going to be noticing. Can you notice what has happened? And that's where that circumflex will come in handy. And here you have on this side a chart form of all of the different possibilities. So the alpha, epsilon, and omicron are on the left. These are your contract vowel endings, and the possibilities of the vowels that it might come in contract with are at the top. And you can see the changes, notice what happens, but there are some pretty easy rules that you can follow. Dr. Plummer has some great tips on how to remember these in his video on Chapter 7. So in what tenses will contraction occur? You've learned the present and the imperfect tenses, and those are the only ones that are affected. Once you move into the future, the aorist, the perfect, these will be adding a consonant at the end of the stem, and that will keep the vowel from contracting. So present tense contract verbs are accented with a circumflex over the syllable where that contraction has occurred. So the non-contract verbs will not have this circumflex. So if you see this circumflex in one of these present or in present verbs, then you're going to know that contraction has occurred. And if you're not sure about the stem, you may need to take the verb apart and work backwards to help you remember what this word might be. So let's take a look at how this plays out with our endings for the word poieo. So poieo is the lexical form of our word, but you'll notice that it's not like the rest of our words in the present first person active indicative singular form. The poieo is actually your first person singular. So poieo is an uncontracted artificial form. You'll never see that in the text, but it's given so that you can understand the paradigm that the word follows. So here we have poio, poies, poie, poiomain, poiete, and poiusin. Now let's take a look at the imperfect of a me. So we learned the a me paradigm for the present tense, and now we're looking at the imperfect. We remember this is the form of to be, and so as such, a lot of times these very common words have become irregular. So for our first person, you have amen, ace, ain, amen, ate, asan. And a little bit here about some syntax issues. So as you have been learning, you are realizing that the accusative case is the direct object for most of your words, and that's very helpful to know. However, some direct objects are found in a different case. So sometimes you'll find a phrase with a genitive or dative case noun, and that ends up being the direct object. So in these cases, you wouldn't translate the genitive with our traditional of or possessive sense, nor would you translate the dative with to or for. Here are some words that take the genitive as a direct object: akuo, archo, krateo, plero. So the example of akuosin, tes phones, they hear the voice, and we see tes phones is in the genitive. So in, as we've learned, we would have probably translated this as they hear of the voice. And so you can see a little bit of how that genitive is being utilized as a direct object. A couple more examples. Ekratesen tes kairos autains. He grasped her hand. And you see that tes kairos is in the genitive, and yet it's being used as a direct object. The next one, epleru onto karas. They were filled with joy. So, we might say they were filled of joy, but with this, you're taking the genitive as a direct object. So filled with joy is the proper way to explain that in the English translation. Then there are some words that take the dative as their direct object. For example, akolotheo, apokrinomai, pisteuo, proskuneo, akolutheosin, auto, they are following him. Apokrinetai, autois, he answers them. So these are words that are in the dative, and you can always tell from that iota subscript, even if you're not sure about the word, that's in the dative singular. They are following him. And then apokrinetai, autois, he answers them. And the dative direct object is also used in these examples. U pisteu te moi. You do not believe me. Or proskunei auto. He was worshiping him. You could say that the worship is being directed to him, is another way of conceptualizing this, but basically just remembering that sometimes some words will take a dative as their direct object. So this chapter has not been a lot of new items, but just a new way to use some of the things you've already been learning. So let's take a look at the vocabulary. Your vocabulary is always to prepare you for the next chapter, and your vocabulary in Chapter 7 is going to set you up for all of your prepositions in Chapter 8. So you have a lot of small words. So I know that sometimes can be more difficult in remembering, and an additional aspect of prepositions is that they can have more than one meaning depending on if they are in the accusative, the genitive, or the dative. So you'll need to memorize the different meanings for each of these different words. So apo means from or away from, dia, through in the genitive, but because of in the accusative, is, into, among, for, in the accusative. It typically takes the accusative is when these words will have a genitive, accusative, or dative. It'll say these words typically take that case. So when you see into, it's typically going to be followed by a word in the accusative. So into, eisegesis, is different than exegesis, which is the next word, which means out of. So ek, from, out of in the genitive, and ein, in, on, at, by, with in the dative. So really depends on your translation, what you might use to convey the sense. And you'll learn more about how to do that with syntax in the future as well. So the next one, epi. And epi could mean on in the genitive, dative, or accusative. So epi, sometimes I just remember on as a starting point and work through some of the translations depending on if it's in the genitive, dative, or accusative to see which one works best with the context of the sentence. So in the genitive, it could be on, upon, over, or in the dative, it could be on, upon, at, or in. In the accusative, could be on, upon, to, or for. Kata is down or against in the genitive, and according to in the accusative. That's one you will see quite often, according to. Meta is with, among in the genitive, or after in the accusative. So for these, a lot of times I would write out a note card and I would label the front side with the vocabulary, para, and then on the back side I would have genitive, from, dative, with, accusative, beside, on, at, and just working on those and having them in the same order as my nominative, genitive, dative, accusative. I started to remember the word better if I had those categories lined up in my brain. Peri, about, concerning, in the genitive, and then in the accusative, it's really more the same kind of idea of about, but more around. We're going about the perimeter of the, we're going around the perimeter of something. Now we have pros, which is to, toward in the accusative. Soon is with in the dative, generally. Uper, for, on behalf of in the genitive, but above or beyond in the accusative. Upo is by in the genitive, or under, below in the accusative. And then nopion, before in the presence of. So for some reason, I don't know, I always thought of inopion, a letter, and you want to open a letter before you go in the presence of someone. So all the different mind tricks that we make up are really important for learning. And so I hope that you are able to continue to get used to these small little words and become more familiar with them. The more you translate, the better you will do. So see if you are able to read some of the New Testament using different softwares, and that will help you to start to get used to the different ways that these vocabularies are used. And we'll talk more about them in the next chapter.